Hi, I'm Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24's correspondent in Washington, D.C., and I'm here today to discuss with General Hayden his new book, The Assault on Intelligence.
Thank you.
General Hayden, your book, The Assault on Intelligence, which we are discussing this afternoon, is so timely. I'd like to begin by talking about what's going on now between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. What do you see as the problems in that?
Oh my, where to begin? Well, the theme of the book is about truth, all right, and frankly, a description of American society, not the president, but American society, as being in a post-truth world, a world in which decisions are made less on facts and evidence and data, more on feeling, emotion, preference, loyalty, tribe, grievance. And we saw that play out. Now, we can get to the strategic international considerations with regard to Helsinki, but here I'm just suggesting fundamental truth-telling. What did the president say? What did he mean? And so he's there in Helsinki, in essence siding with the Russian president when it comes to the question of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And then he comes back to the United States and makes a claim a day or two later that cuts totally against, really, everything he had said on stage at Helsinki. Put another way, all right, the concern in the book, and it's reflected in what happened in Finland and here in Washington in the following days, is that it doesn't seem as if objective reality, truth, is the departure point for the administration's decision-making or its language. It's based on something else, but it's not the objective reality. And so the weekend, the Helsinki summit, was a pretty good example of what I was trying to warn about when I wrote the book.
And how do the Russians take advantage of this lack of attention to the truth?
So I describe this as a kind of a three-layer cake in America. The basic layer is us as a people, and that whole kind of post-truth world I described is rather broad within American political culture. Now we have a president who, frankly, brilliantly identified that during the campaign, exploited it during the campaign, continues to exploit it now, and frankly, by a lot of what he says and does, I think he makes it worse. And then the third layer of the cake, the Russians, who recognize layers 1 and 2, and come in and try to exploit us to further divide us. You know, it's not like the Russians have a point of view on issue 1, issue 2, or issue 3. They just want us to have issues. And so what we see from the Russians is this artificial stimulation of American contentiousness. A contentiousness, unfortunately, though, that is native, that takes its origins from genuine American activities, but the Russians then worsen that situation for their own advantage.
And you called this information dominance a form of hybrid warfare?
Yeah. So what the Russians have done, really quite sophisticated, is to view that information can be a weapon of competition, even a weapon of war. Valery Gerasimov, who's now chief of their general staff, wrote a doctrinal article, maybe half a dozen years ago now, in which he talked about contactless warfare using informational means directly against a target country's population to achieve strategic objectives. And what we're seeing here today is Russia wants to be in competition with the United States. It doesn't nearly have what it takes to be in any kind of genuine competition. It doesn't have the economy. It doesn't have an ideology. It's running out of Russians, frankly, because of a declining population. And so in this competition, rather than competing to match the United States, what it hopes to do is to draw the United States down to its level by dividing, distracting, and diverting us. And that's the Russians' information warfare against America.
Can the Russians use this to divide the U.S. from Europe and undermine NATO?
They can, of course. And unfortunately, remember the three layers of the cake, You've got a population for lots of reasons, and I'm part of that population too. So I'm not trying to be judgmental about us. I'm just trying to be descriptive. But you've got a population now that's kind of prone to get angry. A president that exploits that. And unfortunately, many of the themes he uses to exploit that are themes that are consistent with Russian policy objectives. The president has a view towards the transatlantic relationship different than any president in the last 75 years. The European Union is a foe. I can't imagine any other president saying that. NATO is a burden. And so those are themes that play directly into what the Russians want to do, which is to weaken and divide the West.
And if the Russians are doing this, how can the United States counter it? What should we do?
So there are lots of things that can be done. Number one, we can try to defend ourselves. We can point out fake news when we see it. We can try to prevent Russian bots from getting into American social media and manipulating the domestic American debate. We can extend our laws with regard to political activity in broadcast media. We can do that to social media as well. But those are fundamentally aspirins. They aren't cures. The cure, and I point this out in the book, the cure is us. The cure is returning to a more fact-based, evidence-based approach to national decision-making. I mean, the truth matters. And that's why, and I really appreciated your first question, that's why, this past weekend is just like this small morality play for the broader issue. Reality counts, and we should base our actions and our words as best we can. And I mean, I get it. It's a veil of tears here on earth. We all have to struggle, but as best we can, based our words and our actions on the best view of objective reality that we can create. And the president's wouldn't. I mean, those were flags of convenience. Those were words that were useful for the moment each time they were selected. All right? And the anchor for those words wasn't objective truth. It was utility. Utility in Helsinki on stage, utility back here in Washington. That's bad.
You make a very eloquent case for that. We will do our best to help people understand the problem and how it is exploited by our enemies. If we could shift to talking about the situation in the Middle East and specifically the Kurds. You write in your book of speaking with an Iraqi ambassador who says that the only people who are really committed to the unity of Iraq are people who don't live in Iraq. And the Kurdistan region held an independence referendum last fall. Do you think the United States should have, well, it opposed the referendum. Should the United States have taken a different position?
No, I think not, but that doesn't fly against my basic position. And I had not spoken to the ambassador. I got that from a third party, but he nonetheless said it, all right, that most people, I think it was in essence saying, most people who really concern themselves about this issue aren't the Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds who live in the space we formerly called Iraq. And then that's one of the things I try to point out in the book. So I've got all this going on in America, truth, post-truth, and so on. But you've got so much going on throughout the rest of the world. Fundamental tectonic plates shifting. And a point I make in the book, and I realize making it in a book is easier than making it in policy. All right? But the point I make in the book is that the post-World War I state structure in the Middle East is gone. All right? And it's not coming back, at least it's not coming back in its previous form, where countries like Iraq and Syria were unitary national states. All right? That's been broken up by the events, well, certainly the events of the last 5 years, but it probably goes back further in time. Now, look, I don't think the United States should take it as a responsibility to preside over the dismemberment of what was formerly Iraq. But I do think American policy should keep in mind the reality that the old state structure itself is probably restoring that in its old form is not the solution to today's problems. And very often, you know, when we need to fix this, right? The fix is to get it to the status quo ante. And I suggest in the book, the changes have been so fundamental that status quo ante will not be stable. And so we need to be creative going forward.
And you suggest the United States, I've heard you say before, should view the Kurds as a strategic ally?
Absolutely. Now look, the Kurds have been, frankly, do the math here, certainly in the local region, the Kurds have been America's best friends for decades now. And you know, in this last crisis against ISIS, the Kurds had a virtue that not many people had. They showed up and they fought. All right, and so I do think there is a certain sense of indebtedness we have to the Kurdish people. Now, what does that mean? Where does it go forward? And I already suggested I understand why America was counseling its Kurdish friends that the referendum was not a good idea at this time. All right? And I probably would have had that view in government as well. But what I'm suggesting to my government, that it have a broader view as we go forward. And so a legitimate conversation for America to have with its Turkish allies is, so what would it take for you to be comfortable with a far more Kurdish region to your south? And here I'm talking about not just the autonomous region in Iraq, but the Kurdish portions of Syria as well. I mean, to begin to envision something different than the status quo ante.
So you think the United States should be promoting some kind of dialogue between the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurds
in... the way I put it is the best way I can frame it. And we go to our friends, in Baghdad, go to our friends in Ankara, and saying, what do you need to be comfortable with a far more autonomous Kurdish region in the heart of the Middle East? Now, we'll talk over time how autonomous is autonomous. What does that mean, and so on. And I, frankly, being out of government for 10 years, not knowing the specific details, I don't have a concrete proposal. But I fall back on my original proposition. The old is gone. Okay? A successful policy cannot be based simply on going back to the way it was.
And how do you envision, say, something in Syria, for example?
Yeah. So I'm a little disappointed. Over the past 6 months, the rump Syria, all right, has gotten a lot larger than I thought it would be. And by the rump Syria, I mean the one controlled by Bashar al-Assad with Russian and Iranian support. I think that's actually been a failure of American policy. I think we have left the field too open, too exposed, and to allow the Assad regime, the Russians, the Iranians, to expand. But again, I don't think Syria ever goes back to a unitary national state. Let me give you a way of thinking about this, and this is really rough. All right, it's not the fine print. All right, we're gonna end up with an Alawistan. All right, that's the rump Syria with the Alawites more rather than less in control over other groups, a bit bigger than I thought it would be 6 or 8 months ago. We're going to end up with an Iraq that will, I think, have a pretty predominant Shia identity. I take pains to point out when I talk about this, that does not necessarily mean it's an Iranian satellite. All right? I mean, they're Arabs, they're Persians. The Shia in Iraq think they are the center of Shiism, not Qum. All right? It's Karbala and Najaf. But in Iraq with a largely Shia identity. We talked about a Kurdish region. So I've got an Alawistan, kind of a Shiistan, a Kurdistan, and here I'm thinking more of just than the Iraqi autonomous region. And then the last piece that needs to be created, from my view of stability, is a Sunnistan.
Well, that's very interesting.
And again, I'm using the word entities here, not necessarily countries, not necessarily seats at the United Nations, but entities that in which populations feel relatively comfortable. And so again, we're kind of getting an Alawistan. Iraq has kind of gotten a bit more stable as a Shiistan. We've talked about Kurdistan. Sunnistan remains the problem. We had a Sunnistan. We didn't like it. It was governed by ISIS. It was an unacceptable Sunnistan. And so, to my mind, the last building project left here is, can we build a Sunnistan that both we and the Sunnis can live with? And again, I'm using the word entity rather than formal states and boundaries and checkpoints and so on.
So you're saying that these political communities should match the predominant identity of the people who live in?
That is, frankly, my sense of the case. Now look, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago when former Vice President Biden was calling for us to kind of create the dissolution of Iraq, I was opposed to that. But events have taken place. Events have taken their course. New realities have been created. And by the way, Kurdistan does not have to be hostile to the new Iraq, doesn't have to be hostile to the Sunni entity, does not have to be hostile to the Alawi entity. I mean, but my sense is that offers greater opportunity for stability than any effort to try to recreate the unitary Iraqi and unitary Syrian states.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, that is, after all, the basis of Western politics, that the political identities match.
Yeah, and to be fair, to be totally honest, those aren't the people in the region's lines. Those are Western lines, and they lasted 100 years, but they were artificial lines, and the artificial lines were kept in place by power. They were kept in place by colonial power. They were kept in place by the power of the dynamics of the Cold War, as countries lined up. They were kept in place by the power of local autocrats. And all those are gone now. And now we need a new formula. And my sense is, and again, I don't want to be exclusionist. I'm not talking about the mass migration of people and forced expulsions and ethnic cleansing, but I am talking about entities, in which Kurds feel as if they have a good role in governing, and Sunnis and Shia and so on.
Well, that's very interesting, and we need creative thinking about the Middle East. Let me ask you one more question, sir, if I may. Turkey, how do you see the future of U.S.-Turkey relations?
It's troubled. I think we had some pretty high hopes for President Erdogan back in the late Bush administration. Secretary Rice, I can recall in one conversation, my words now, not hers, but I think they summarized it. This is political Islam we can bet on. This is political Islam we can support. It was I mean, they weren't like Christian Democrats in Germany, but it was a form of Islam that was inclusive, a form of political Islam that was inclusive and progressive and so on. Unfortunately, the longer it's gone on, the more fundamentalist and the more autocratic President Erdogan has become. And frankly, in terms of his foreign policy, the more erratic he has become. And so it's quite a challenge for American diplomacy. I go to Turkey. I've gone to Turkey a lot. Turkish people could not have treated me with more kindness and hospitality. I have a great affection for Turkey. And so I hope we can work our way forward to some kind of better future in our relationship.
Sir, what is your view now that the United States has left the Iranian nuclear deal? What should policy be, to change the behavior of the regime, you think, or to overthrow it?
Certainly we considered all options in the Bush administration, but it was our judgment that any American fingerprint on that kind of activity would almost guarantee its failure. If there's going to be a change in government, style of government, inside Iran, it's got to come from within. And again, an outside fingerprint on it undercuts the legitimacy of those who would want to change the way Iran is governed. I would have advised against my government's backing away from the Iranian nuclear deal, from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, I wasn't a fan. I've written an awful lot kind of nipping at this part of the deal or that part of the deal. I think we should have driven a much harder bargain. But once it was in place, number one, the word of a country should mean something. And number two, the Iranians weren't cheating. And they were further away from a weapon with the deal than they would be without it. So I would have kept the deal. But I'd have gone after the Iranians in a lot of other areas You know, the Iranians are in the ascendance in 4 Arab capitals. They're in the ascendance in Baghdad, in Sana'a, in Damascus, and in Beirut. And Iranian interests and American interests are very much opposed in each of those countries. So although I would have pushed back strongly against the Iranians, I would not have tried to do it through the nuclear treaty, which to my mind had at least parked the nuclear problem for a number of years. Again, I get all the weaknesses of the treaty, but I would have left that one there and gone after some of these other activities where I do think we could have gotten, particularly our European friends, more actively involved.
We've had a fascinating discussion today with General Hayden on his book, The Assault on Intelligence. Thank you, sir, very much for your insights.
Thank you. My pleasure.